Also in Lincoln, Nebraska's 12-week abortion ban is now written into the state constitution. Now with that, Nebraska becomes the first state in the nation to enshrine abortion restrictions. Governor Jim Pillen signed that proclamation yesterday. Voters passed the abortion initiative back in November. Now there are exceptions for rape, incest, and if the patient's life is in danger.
Well, just days after the election, Pillen praised the passing of the initiative in a post on Facebook. And last month, he said in part, quote, "For the first time in history, preborn babies in Nebraska have a floor of constitutional protection. We are a pro-life state, and our people proved it."
Well, the ACLU of Nebraska sent us a statement in response saying, in quote, "Anti-abortion politicians got what they wanted. The loss of an initiative to protect abortion rights through a rival campaign that relied on deceit. As a result, Nebraskans needing care after 12 weeks will have to continue to flee the state or carry pregnancies against their will," end quote.